Hello, everyone. There's someone carrying feelings for you that are bigger than anything they've experienced before. And that magnitude, that intensity, it's terrifying them. Not because they don't want to feel this way, but because feeling this much for another person means vulnerability they're not used to navigating, means risk they've been trained to avoid, means opening themselves to the possibility of devastation in ways that their previous connections never required. And that terror is keeping them silent, even though the silence is its own kind of suffering. They're standing at the edge of honesty and they can't quite bring themselves to jump. This isn't about casual interest or surface level attraction. This is about someone who's been caught off guard by the depth of what they feel when they're near you, who thinks about you in quiet moments and feels their chest tighten with something they can't quite name but definitely can't ignore, who replays conversations you've had and finds meaning in gestures you probably don't even remember making. And all of this internal experience, all of this private intensity, it exists in direct contrast to how they're showing up externally. Cool, controlled, casual, like you're just another person when you're actually the person who's reordering their entire emotional landscape. Some of you might already sense the disconnect, might feel that there's more happening beneath the surface than what they're allowing you to see, might notice moments where their mask slips and you catch glimpses of something vulnerable before they recover and retreat back into whatever protective performance they're maintaining. There is a sense that this person has a history that makes this current feeling dangerous. Maybe they've been hurt before in ways that taught them love equals pain. Maybe they've watched relationships destroy people they care about. Maybe they've internalized messages about emotions being weakness or vulnerability being liability. Maybe they've just never felt something this consuming and they don't have a framework for metabolizing it that doesn't involve either suppressing it completely or letting it overwhelm them. And what makes this particularly complicated is that the usual strategies they've used to manage attraction aren't working. They can't talk themselves out of how they feel about you. They can't minimize it. They can't redirect their attention to safer options. They've tried, and it keeps coming back. You keep coming back. The feeling keeps intensifying rather than fading. And that persistence, that refusal of their emotions to be controlled or managed, it's showing them that what they feel for you isn't like anything they've felt before. And that recognition is both thrilling and absolutely terrifying. This reflection invites you to consider, how does it feel to imagine being loved by someone who's never loved this way before? And does that feel like gift or burden? It's possible this person is struggling with worthiness, not your worthiness, theirs. They might look at you and see someone so incredible, so put together, so valuable that they can't imagine what they could possibly offer that would be enough. They might be comparing themselves to some imagined version of who you deserve and finding themselves lacking. They might be convinced that if you really knew them, really saw all their flaws and fears and failures, you couldn't possibly want them the way they want you. And that internal narrative, that story they're telling themselves about not being enough, it's creating paralysis. Because if they believe they're not good enough for you, then expressing their feelings becomes an act of exposing their inadequacy, becomes setting themselves up for the rejection they already believe is inevitable, so they stay silent. They protect themselves through not risking They manage the pain of not having you by convincing themselves they never could have had you anyway. Um, there's also something here about control and the illusion of it. This person might be someone who's built their life around maintaining control over their emotions, over their circumstances, over how vulnerable they allow themselves to be. And you, without even trying, you've dismantled that control. You've made them feel things they didn't plan to feel. You've created wants they didn't authorize. You've become important in ways they didn't consent to. And that loss of control, that being at the mercy of feelings they can't manage, it's exposing them to a kind of powerlessness that's deeply uncomfortable for someone who's used to being the one in charge of their emotional reality. It can seem as if loving you has made them weak. At least that's how they might be framing it to themselves. Like this tenderness they feel, this yearning, this constant awareness of you. It's a vulnerability they can't afford, an exposure they're not equipped to handle, so they're trying to armor themselves against it, trying to act like it's not happening, trying to pretend they're unaffected when every interaction with you leaves them more affected than the last. Um, some of you might be frustrated by this, by the mixed signals, by the way they look at you sometimes like you're everything and then act like you're nothing, by the intensity you feel from them in certain moments, followed by distance that makes you question if you imagined the whole thing. And that frustration is valid because you can't respond appropriately to feelings that aren't being expressed. You can't meet someone in vulnerability they're not willing to show. You can't build something real with someone who's too scared to admit what's real for them. But what if their fear isn't about you? What if it's about themselves? What if they're not hiding from you, but from the size of their own feelings? What if what terrifies them isn't your potential rejection, but their own capacity to feel this deeply, to need this much, to want with this kind of intensity? This reflection invites you to consider if someone's fear of their own feelings is keeping them from being honest with you. Is that something you can be patient with, or does patience become complicity in your own diminishment? Um, there's a particular kind of love that emerges when someone who's been emotionally defended for years finally meets a person who gets past all their protections. And it's not gentle, it's not comfortable, it's intense and destabilizing and feels like a threat to everything they've built their safety around. And this person, they might be experiencing that kind of love, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that doesn't care about their carefully constructed walls, the kind that just is undeniable and consuming, regardless of whether they think it's wise or safe or timely. Um, and navigating that, learning to be honest about feelings that big when you've spent years minimizing or avoiding or controlling emotional experience. That's not something that happens overnight. That's a process that requires them to essentially become a different person, someone who can acknowledge need without seeing it as weakness, someone who can express desire without immediately protecting themselves from disappointment, someone who can say I love you without 17 qualifiers and exit strategies attached. It may feel as though this person is waiting for something, for a sign from you, for perfect conditions, for their fear to magically disappear, for certainty about outcomes. But what they're really waiting for is courage, for the internal resources to handle the vulnerability of honesty, for the strength to risk being seen fully and potentially being rejected, for the capacity to exist in the uncertainty of not knowing how you'll respond without immediately protecting themselves from worst case scenarios. And courage doesn't just appear, It has to be cultivated. It has to be practiced. And for someone who's spent years avoiding situations that require emotional bravery, finding that courage isn't simple. It requires them to question patterns that have kept them safe, to challenge beliefs about what vulnerability means, to imagine a version of themselves that can be open without being destroyed by it. Um, some of you might be in positions where you could make this easier for them, where you could initiate the conversation they're too scared to start, where you could create safety through your own vulnerability, where you could show them through your actions that being honest with you won't lead to the devastation they're imagining. And maybe you want to do that. Maybe you're willing to be the brave one because you recognize that what you could build together is worth the risk of going first. But you also need to consider whether it's your job to make someone else's emotional honesty easier, whether constantly having to be the one who goes first, who creates safety, who does the emotional labor of making vulnerability possible, whether that's a dynamic that serves you long term. Because if they can't find courage to be honest about loving you, what other honesty will they struggle with? What other hard conversations will you have to initiate because they're too scared to start them? This reflection invites you to consider if you have to make it easy for someone to love you out loud. Is that the kind of love that can sustain itself through actual difficulty? There's also the possibility that their nervousness about honesty is actually intuition, that somewhere inside them they know the timing isn't right, that circumstances aren't aligned, that admitting their feelings would create complications neither of you is ready to navigate. And maybe they're honoring that intuition by staying silent. Maybe their hesitation is wisdom rather than cowardice. Maybe waiting, as frustrating as it is actually the mature choice, given whatever constraints or complications exist. It can seem as if they want to tell you, but something legitimate is holding them back. Not just fear for fear's sake, but real concerns about consequences, about how honesty would change dynamics in ways that might not be manageable right now, about responsibilities or commitments or situations that make acting on their feelings impossible, even if the feelings themselves are undeniable. Some of you might need to hear this. Someone loving you in silence doesn't obligate you to wait for them to find their voice. Someone having intense feelings they're too scared to express doesn't mean you need to put your life on hold while they work through their fear. You're allowed to need more than unexpressed love. You're allowed to require actual honesty and presence and willingness to be vulnerable. You're allowed to decide that someone's internal process, however valid, isn't something you're available to orbit around while they figure themselves out. Because here's what often happens. You sense that someone has feelings for you. You feel the intensity. You pick up on all the unspoken things. And because you sense it, because you know it's there, you start treating it as if it's been said. You start factoring their silent love into your decisions. You start waiting. You start being loyal to something that hasn't actually been claimed or committed to or made real through honest expression. And that waiting, that loyalty to potential rather than actuality, it can keep you stuck. It can prevent you from being available for connections where honesty doesn't require this much excavation, where love is expressed rather than hidden, where you don't have to read between lines or interpret silences or wonder if what you're sensing is real or imagined. It may feel as though you're being asked to choose between patience and self-protection, between giving this person space to work through their fear and requiring that they show up with honesty if they want access to you, between understanding their struggle and refusing to make their struggle your problem to manage. And these aren't easy choices because patience can be generous, but it can also be self-abandonment. And requirements can be healthy boundaries, but they can also be ultimatums that push away something that just needs more time. This reflection invites you to consider what's the difference between patient compassion and enabling someone's avoidance, and which side of that line are you on. There's beauty in being loved by someone who's never felt this way before, in being the person who finally breaks through someone's defenses, in mattering so much that even someone terrified of vulnerability is considering risking it. And if this person does eventually find the courage to tell you what they feel, if they do manage to push through their fear and be honest, that honesty will mean something. It will carry weight. It will be evidence that you're worth facing their deepest fears for. But beauty doesn't erase frustration, and the meaningfulness of eventual honesty doesn't compensate for the pain of current silence. So you need to be realistic about what you're willing to tolerate, about how long you're willing to exist in ambiguity, about whether this person's process is something you have capacity to be patient with, or whether your own needs for clarity and directness are more important than accommodating their fear. Some of you might also be wondering if what you're sensing is real, if maybe you're reading too much into things, if perhaps this person doesn't actually feel as intensely as you think they do, and you're just projecting your own hopes onto their behavior. And that's a valid question, because intense feelings that aren't expressed can look a lot like mild interest that's being polite. And the difference between someone who's in love but scared and someone who's just friendly can be subtle from the outside. So trust your intuition, but also stay grounded in what's actually happening, in what's being said and done, rather than just what you're sensing or hoping. Because you deserve relationships based on reality, not on what you have to decode or interpret or intuit. You deserve someone who makes their interest clear, who doesn't leave you guessing, who's brave enough to be honest even when honesty is scary. It can seem as if this person is at war with themselves. One part of them desperately wants to tell you everything, wants to be vulnerable, wants to take the risk, wants to find out if what they feel could be reciprocated. And another part is absolutely convinced that honesty will lead to disaster, that you'll reject them, that they'll be humiliated, that expressing love will give you power they can't afford to surrender. And those two parts are locked in battle, creating the paralysis you're witnessing, creating the mixed signals, creating the frustration of sensing something that won't be claimed. And eventually, one side will win. Either their desire for connection will overcome their fear, or their fear will convince them that staying silent is safer. But you don't have to wait to find out which. You don't have to make your choices contingent on their internal resolution. You can decide right now what you're available for, what you require, what you're willing to accept, and what crosses lines you're not willing to have crossed. So here's what you need to know. Being loved intensely by someone who's too scared to say it doesn't make you special. Being the person someone has unprecedented feelings for doesn't obligate you to anything. Someone's nervousness about honesty, while understandable, isn't your responsibility to manage or accommodate or wait patiently for them to overcome. You're allowed to need what you need, to want what you want, to require honesty and presence and vulnerability as baseline rather than aspirational. And if this person can offer that, if they can push through their fear and actually show up with the fullness of what they feel, then maybe you have something worth exploring. But if their fear is stronger than their love, if their need for self-protection is more important than their desire for connection with you, if they continue choosing silence over the risk of honesty, then you have information, clear information about what being with them would actually be like, about how many other hard conversations you'd have to initiate, about how much emotional labor you'd carry, about how often you'd have to make it safe for them to be real with you. And you deserve better than that. You deserve someone whose love for you is stronger than their fear, who chooses vulnerability over protection, who's willing to risk being hurt because being with you matters more than staying safe. This reflection invites you to consider, if this person never finds the courage to be honest, what will you do with all the love you've been holding space for?